So I'm not going to talk here about 5, I'm just going to talk about 1, because there isn't enough time to talk about 5. And that's the 1. The first thing you notice about life on Earth is its incredible diversity. I mean, you just have to look around you, just go outside here. You will see lots of plants, birds, insects, people walking their dogs, and so on. We don't even know how many species there are on life on Earth. The latest estimates put it at maybe 8.7 million. But the number could maybe even be as high as 100 million. There are birds that fly up 35,000 feet in the air. There are shrimp that live 35,000 feet in the deep ocean. The second thing you notice about life on Earth is an incredible degree of adaptation and this kind of a scratch my back and I'll scratch yours type relationship, which we call symbiosis. The bee, if you look at the bee, it has just the size to fit inside the flower on which it feeds, and then its body gets polluted with this pollen, which it transfers to another flower, and so on. And this particular fish here, this clownfish, lives among the poisonous tentacles of this sea anemone, and they protect each other, and the body of the fish is covered with this mucus, which protects it against the poisonous tentacles of its own host, and so on. Now, these two things, the incredible diversity and this incredible degree of adaptation, has led naturalists over centuries to conclude that there must be some guiding hand around here, some grand designer, and so on. And all of this held, people thought this was true until one man changed all this, and this is that man, Charles Darwin. And he, in one book, in 1859, just changed the whole picture that we have on biology and life on Earth. Literally, we like to talk about evolution, but this was really a revolution. Now, one thing I like to do is, when I talk about people like this, is actually go to the places where they worked and so on. So I actually held in my hand this first copy of Darwin's book and so on. It's enormous feeling. I strongly recommend it. One thing Darwin didn't like to do is publish genealogies. He never published one, actually. We're so familiar with these kind of trees and things and so on. He never published one. But in his own notebooks, and I actually held this notebook as well, he actually did sometimes draw this for himself, just to help his thought process. And I particularly like this one because, he has primates at the bottom and he has men at the top. He did this actually not for his first book, but for a later book that he did. Now, what is it that Darwin actually do? He came up with this theory of evolution by means of natural selection. This theory, this grand theory, had 4 main pillars to it, and those 4 main pillars were supported by one grand mechanism. Now, this drawing that you see there had nothing to do with Darwin. It comes from a Hindu myth. But I liked it because it has like 4 pillars that are supported by one grand mechanism. And, this supports the whole theory. So it fit very nicely what I wanted to say. By the way, there is an apocryphal story that is almost certainly not true, but it's so good that I have to tell it to you. I mean, there is a proverb in Italian which is "Si non è vero è ben trovato." Even if it's not true, it's a good story. And I want to tell you this story. So there is a story that Bertrand Russell once gave a talk about this, and he had a drawing like this, and then some lady from the audience asked him, "On what does that giant turtle stand on?" And he said, "On another giant turtle." He says, "On what does that giant turtle stand on?" He said, "Yet another giant turtle." "And on what does that stand on?" He said, "Lady, I'm afraid from there it's turtles all the way down." So it almost certainly didn't happen, but it's a good story. Now, what are these 4 pillars? So the first is evolution itself. Namely, species are not immutable. They didn't always exist. In fact, most of the species on Earth have become extinct. We just see, the things that have evolved from all of these things. Second, gradualism. Darwin borrowed this from his geologist friend. In particular, Lyell was a personal friend of his. Basically, in the same way that changes in the earth happen very slowly, this erosion and so on, the species are the same. Namely, you cannot just watch a species and see it turn from one into another. It takes tens of thousands of generations for actually species to evolve. The third was common descent. Common descent is the idea that all the diversity of life on Earth that we see today, all those species started from one life form. And this is actually at the basis for all of our search into what we call the origin of life. You see, we think that life started from one thing. There was some chemistry that led to one life form, and from that we got everything else. So that's that. And then there is speciation. You see, Darwin was still aware of the fact that there are many, many species. So how did that happen? So he said, the way it happens is that you have branchings or splittings. And at every such node, you double the number of species, and therefore you can increase the number enormously. And he did that drawing in his notebook with all these branching and so on. And that's how things work. Now, how does that actually happen? We think we know today how it happens. You could have, some sort of species of cows that live on the dry side of a mountain, and then some of them, wander to the wet side, and over many, many generations and so on, eventually they cannot anymore interbreed. You have a new species. Now, I like this page from Darwin's notebook because look what he wrote at the top. He wrote, "I think." He was very humble at that stage, Wasn't absolutely sure. Now, as I said, all of this was supported by one grand mechanism, the turtle in this case, which is natural selection. Natural selection is a very simple idea when it's pointed out to you. Philosopher Daniel Dennett wrote once that he thought that natural selection was the single best idea anybody has ever had. And I kind of tend to agree with that. So what's the idea? The idea is like this. Suppose certain members of a species have a certain characteristic that gives them a certain advantage. And suppose, in addition, that particular characteristic is inheritable. Then over time, what's going to happen is that the whole population is going to shift towards that particular characteristic. Now, where do we actually see natural selection? So here is one very simple example. There is this light-colored peppered moth, which existed in the United Kingdom. And when at the beginning, it was so well camouflaged, if you look at the bottom image there, that you can hardly even see the light-colored one. But then in 1848 came the Industrial Revolution, and they poured enormous amounts of soot into the atmosphere, which blackened all the trees and everything, all the plants, and that light-colored peppered moth started sticking out like a sore thumb. But at the same time, the melanic, the dark version of that peppered moth, actually started to be better camouflaged. The point was that the light-colored one became almost extinct because it became the target of massive predation. Now, those of you who maybe don't believe in green practices, well, it turns out that because they started to adopt greener practices and were pouring less soot into the atmosphere, eventually they actually managed to save the light-colored peppered moth from extinction. Now, on the right-hand side, there are just a few examples of red snakes there that, depending on the environment, they develop different colors and so on. The place where we actually see mostly natural selection today, of course, is with bacteria. And the reason is that the populations are humongous and they multiply very, very fast. As a result of this, we develop such things as MRSA, bacteria that are resistant to most antibiotics. And there are even bacteria that may be resistant to all antibiotics. And it's a serious problem because until very recently, we haven't discovered new antibiotics in 2 decades. So, we are to blame, by the way, for this. It's not we always blame the doctors, but we are to blame. The doctor prescribes antibiotics, says you have to take it 10 days. We take it 2 days. We feel a little bit better. We stop taking it. Well, guess what? That's how bacteria resistant to antibiotics happen. So anyhow, the point of all of this is that Darwin created the theory that explained essentially everything about life on Earth. So where is his blunder? Well, Darwin didn't know any genetics. We cannot blame him for that. Nobody knew genetics at the time. So the theory of genetics that existed at the time was blending heredity, which said the characteristics of the mother and the father get mixed in the offspring just like you would mix paints or gin and tonic, for that matter. And Darwin adopted this because he didn't know any better. That's the theory that he adopted. His huge blunder was in not recognizing that if that were truly the theory of genetics, if this was the theory of heredity, natural selection could never have worked at all. And the reason is very simple, and let me just explain that. So if you look on the left-hand side there, suppose you have a certain characteristic that I denoted by capital A, and that gives the color black. And lowercase a gives the color white. And suppose that black actually gives some advantage. What happens in blending heredity? The offspring gets one capital A, one small a, gets the color gray. But it's not just that. Capital A and lowercase a cease to exist. They become blent into this thing I called A1. So that is gray. And that's it. Black has disappeared and will never come again. No way the population will shift to become black. Suppose I had 1 million butterflies. One was black, the other white. The black will mate with a white, will give you a gray butterfly. The gray will mate with another white, will give a paler shade of gray butterfly, and so on. You will never get the population becoming black again, as Darwin wanted. So with blending heredity, nothing would have worked. Now, what is the true theory of heredity? That came from Gregor Mendel. And he understood that the way heredity works is not like gin and tonic. It's like shuffling cards. If I have a jack, and having a jack is good, it doesn't matter if I shuffle it with more cards, I still have the jack. That's how it works. So, for example, if you look at the example on the right there, you know, you get one A, one big A, one small a, it gives you the color gray, but the individual A's continue to be there. And so that in the next generation, when big A mates with a big A, it gives you black. And the other one will give gray, and the other one will give white. And over the generation, if big A confers indeed an advantage, the whole population could turn black. Now, once this was pointed out to Darwin, he actually understood that there is a serious problem. And this was pointed out by an engineer, Fleming Jenkins. And he understood that there is this problem, and he also understood that he must somehow correct for this. And on occasion, he had some very insightful pronouncements. One is in 1857, even before he published The Origin of Species. He said, you know, he thinks that maybe heredity will turn out to be more like mixing and not like fusion, more like cards and not, you know, like gin and tonic. And then in 1866, he actually had an observation that, you know, you hit yourself on the head and say, how didn't anybody else think about that? Look, he said, every male and female of the world produce a distinct male or female, and not some intermediate hermaphrodite, which would have happened had it been just blending like colors, right? So he indeed noticed that something is wrong, but unfortunately, he didn't know any mathematics. Probability was far from him. He really couldn't quite absorb all of this, didn't come up with a correct theory. Now, a few people have suggested that Darwin's late in life pronouncements about heredity, you know, being not blending, came because he did read, actually, a Mendel's paper. Mendel's paper was published in in 1856. No, 18, somewhere around that, 1865, published in 1865. So that when Darwin talked later about this, he may have read this. So fortunately, Andrew Sclater from the Darwin Project looked into this, and I further looked into this, and we discovered the following. First of all, Darwin never had any copy of Mendel's paper in his possession, which is not surprising because it appeared in some obscure journal of the Brun Academy, which Darwin never subscribed to. But it's true that Darwin had 2 books in his possession at the time of his death, which actually mentioned Mendel's experiments with peas. Mendel did experiments with peas. So no fewer than 4 books claim that Darwin probably read about Mendel's experiments in those books. Well, one of them, you read what is written there, no way, even if Darwin read it, he would not have known anything from that because the person there wrote very little about the whole experiment. The second book is a little bit more intriguing, and it was this book by somebody named Föcke, who wrote something about these Mendel's experiments. Now, I actually asked for Darwin's copy of that book to be brought to me, and I give you there a picture of that book. Do you know where Mendel's experiment is mentioned? It is in those uncut pages. You remember that in all books you had to cut them at the top to actually read the thing? Darwin never read that book. And even had he read it, he would not have been much illuminated because Föcke himself did not understand anything from Mendel's experiments. So no, Darwin did not know about Mendel's experiments. Now, there are 4 other people that I study their blunders and talk about them and so on. But you will notice that I call them brilliant blunders. And this brings me to one of the main messages that I want to convey here. When science is presented, it is often presented, and I mean in school, in media, or otherwise, as a pure success story. It's a direct path from A to B. Nothing can be further from the truth. Science is really this zigzag path with lots of false starts, blind alleys, and sometimes having to go all the way back to the point where you started. Now, it's more than that. We encourage our children not to make any mistakes. And this is the entire education system. Our funding agencies don't encourage making any mistakes. Now, I want to make this very clear. I don't encourage sloppy science or careless science. But in order to make progress in science, or in fact any creative enterprise, you actually have to allow for this thinking outside the box. And thinking outside the box means that you think in unconventional ways. And guess what? Sometimes when you do that, you make blunders. But sometimes, to get to the real breakthroughs, that's what you need to do. Because, if you are stuck in a minimum of something, a tiny, tiny infinitesimal shift is not going to get you out of there. You have to do what mathematicians call a finite amplitude perturbation, to get out of there. And that's the part that really is sometimes needed. Actually, all startup companies are based on this concept. Yes, they fail most of the time, but those lead to the actual breakthroughs. Now, it's very hard to do when it comes to things like funding and so on, but it can be done. For example, with the Hubble Space Telescope, we had for a while a practice where time allocations committees were encouraged to save 10% of the telescope time, which is very valuable and hard to get, for proposals deemed risky, which meant proposals that there was some chance they would not achieve their declared goals, but that if they did, the potential reward was enormous. So basically, my final message here is that what I call brilliant blunders can actually be the portals to discovery. Thank you very much.